This is Democracy Here. My name is Maryelen Calderwood, and today we have Senator Jo Comerford, who covers Franklin, Hampshire, Worcester districts in Massachusetts. Jo Comerford was also overwhelmingly endorsed by Franklin County, continuing the political revolution.
Worker, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My mother is a feminist and she taught me to see until we all have
Hi, Jo.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure for me. Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. I have to tell you, we did not plan to interview you on International Women's Day, but it's sort of a wonderful thing that we're doing this.
It is.
Yeah.
I was coming in and I thought, I get to be with Maryelen.
That's right.
And this wonderful GCTV on International Women's Day. Yeah, it's perfect.
There's so much happening, and it's so wonderful to have women's voices in everywhere from school committees all the way up to Congress.
It is the change we need.
It is the
It's
change
one
we
of the
need.
changes we need.
Yes.
I know you agree, right? We need folks of color also.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
To be much more represented in government.
Yes.
But I'm glad for women and some younger lawmakers at all levels, as you say.
Right. Diversity all the way.
All the way.
So I'm kind of interested, just casting a wide net over women in politics. You didn't really run on being a woman. You ran on being a progressive. You ran as someone who was going to be the voice for a very progressive area of the Commonwealth, plus everyone else in the Commonwealth.
Right.
And you're here. You're here, and you're a senator, and you represent us. What's it like now that you're in the Senate, being a female? Should the focus, and is the focus for you on a daily basis, the fact that you were a female senator, or the fact that you are now a lawmaker and you are representing men and women?
Yeah.
What's it like?
Such a good question.
Yeah.
So you're right. I didn't do an identity campaign per se, but certainly I think we know, and in many of the stops that I know you were at and others were at, I certainly talked about the way in which me being a woman and a mom of 2 adopted kids, queer, right, married to a woman, all of those things inform me happily, right? But I ran on the issues. I ran on education, healthcare, the environment, revenue, and the ways in which we have to stop this austerity budgeting in the Commonwealth that basically starves our programs. So I ran on those things. So moving into the State House now, it's a very natural transition for me. Certainly, the things that I'm standing up for immediately are the issues that I ran on, and certainly my community, our community, is very much top of mind, in terms of what can I do every single day to make government work in the best interest of my 160,000 constituents in the Hampshire, Franklin, Worcester district, these 24 cities and towns, on the issues that I know folks most care about, and how do I bend government in our direction out here in Western Massachusetts? So that's what I think about a lot.
Yeah, and so you're being in the State House and you're being a woman. Are you finding that there's less focus on the fact that you are female? And is there a discussion about how women in politics, particularly, let's just focus on Franklin, Worcester, have been able to change and adjust the conversation based on the fact that you're female?
That's a good question. So, our Senate president is a woman as well. So there is this both sea change from our district, and then in the Senate, we're having a woman leader, and there's many people who she appointed to leadership who are also women. So certainly through her eyes and her actions and words, we are continuing to recognize, for example, in the legislature, that 20,000 men have served in the legislature since the onset of the legislature, and 200 women, including the folks who are there now.
Yeah.
That's a great disparity. She says that all the time. Certainly the issues that she's pushing forward are issues that I know both we care about here in the district, but also have been brought forward and really raised the volume on, and a lot by women who are taking office, women leaders in local communities. So I think it's a both and, right? We're here to do the people's business, to be everybody's legislature and legislator, right? That's my job. And then there is a conversation, a simmering, if you will, of women who are saying, okay, these odds are ridiculous, right? And they're worse for people of color, as we were saying earlier, and younger people. And women have a particular point of view that we want heard. And it often centers around community services, what we need for our families. Certainly in the environment, women have a big stake, right, with mothers out front. So I think as we see women leaders coming in, I do think the conversation will shift, but it might not shift only to these traditional women's issues. I was at a conference the other day and someone said, well, what bills do you think are women's bills? And I said, every bill is a woman's bill. We're all, it's 2019, every issue is a woman's issue. We might have a particular perspective on it and a particular desire, but the whole world should be open to us, as the whole world is open to men.
So it sounds like you see sort of the gap between the political conversation, political discourse narrowing in terms of it being specifically gender related. It's more like this is all of these bills that you have proposed, and I believe there are 48, we're not going to talk about all 48. I save you from that. But that it's more about what benefits people.
Yeah, it's what benefits
children,
people.
Families.
And yes, we have a particular lens on that.
Right.
We have I have a particular point of view.
Right.
But it's really, we should be looking at everything as women. We shouldn't just, for example, confine ourselves to what are traditional women's bills.
Right.
We should look at everything, and we should bring our particular voices, our particular point of views, our particular tenacity as we go forward.
And what I find unique about your perspective, and in your approach, rather, is that I pulled up the editorial, not the editorial, the letter to the editor that you wrote about the 48 bills. And you called it a package. It's a package called Progress for All. And what you write about is that all of these pieces of legislation that you've filed come from conversation.
Yeah.
They come from one-on-one conversation. They come from the bottom up, which seems to be what the conversation has been for the last several years.
You're totally right.
Yeah.
And it's the only way government's going to work.
Right.
So we know this, right? Frederick Douglass taught us that power concedes nothing without demand. Right? It never has, never will. So right now, if we think about the legislature as a place where there's a consolidation of power, certainly there are people, and we are well represented in this delegation from the Hampshire, Franklin, Worcester district and the Western Mass region. We go to work every day. We want to do the best for our districts. But we still, even us, we need to be pushed and held accountable. But certainly the legislature and the governor and all of the agencies, they're not going to move unless we make them move.
Yeah, exactly. And that's I think that's why you were so initially and continue to be very popular with FCCPR, because you talk to us. And now that you're still talking to us because you have a YouTube conversation with people. Here I am at my desk. By the way, you should hang your pictures up.
I know. I haven't even moved in yet. I know. We hit the ground. I know.
So you definitely, that was sort of the motto, I'm going to hit the ground running, and you definitely did. And some of the legislation that you filed, you started the conversation with climate change, affordable quality health care, public transportation, affordable housing, sustainable agriculture, diversity, et cetera. One of the first bills that you filed was the Cherish bill, right?
Thanks to the MTA.
That's right. And that's funding for public higher education. Very close to my heart, not only because it's the work that I do as I advocate for public education educators, but as mom, who's had a son in public education, who's 17 years old. He's never had a fully funded education system, ever. And so talk to me about Cherish, and talk to me about what you can talk to me about Promise, which is pre-K through 12.
Absolutely.
And what sets these two bills apart from the governor's bill?
Sure. So these are all really good questions. I want to just go back for a second
Sure.
to talk about the origin of the bills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, right, just as we said that government needs to be held accountable and
Yes.
government won't work until people make it work, right? That's that kind of partnership that we're doing, that I feel like I'm doing with FCCPR, where I say, okay, gang, you elected me, I'm in the State House, I'm going to work here. I need to reach across and hold hands, you know, virtually or actually literally in person, to say, okay, we're going to be stronger when I can say to, you know, my constituents, I can say to my colleagues, you know, hey, look, the people in my district are demanding this. We have to do this. And I also then go to other lawmakers and say, look, the people in your district are demanding it. We're together here. We need to move this bill. So that's the kind of inside-outside partnership that I think is so effective. And then the origin of the bills, just super quickly, the thing I really love most about this slate of bills is that the ideas were born during the campaign. You know, so during the campaign, for example, you know, I reached out, you and I had a conversation, right? And it ignited this conversation with the MTA, larger conversation, where I said, hey, I'm running because I really want to fight for public education. And so we built those relationships. When I was up here, you know, in house parties in Greenfield, people asked me questions like, why don't we have Greenfield Rail anymore, right? And I put a study in for Greenfield Rail. When I was in Hadley, a farmer said, why is my farmland, small piece of farmland, taxed differently than this other farmland? Well, it's because there's a problem with our tax code. So I have a piece of legislation based on that. You know, the people of Wendell can't get solar interconnectivity. I have something about, you know, making the solar companies do better business for our local communities in terms of interconnectivity. So, you know, the ideas come from this community, which I love. So to your question about the promise and the charity.
No, that's right. I mean, I think this is important too, because you know, you do come as a sort of a cohort, because it was, you know, through tragedy, serendipity, everything, that you all came into this together. I mean, Natalie, Lindsay, Mindy,
Dan.
Yeah, there's so many that you came in as a cohort. So you are all, there's not going to be any difference between the needs of folks in Montague and Greenfield, because we all have families. We're all the same sort of people. We're living in Western Massachusetts. So you come, it seems that you come together with this strength in this cohort. And that must be very helpful for you to be able to push your, you know, what you, the policies and the laws that you want to create in Massachusetts based on those conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, there's great partnership. This delegation had a history of good partnership. And, you know, I'm happy to say that in many respects, we are continuing that kind of, you know, Senate House, right? So there's the community and the legislature, that's a partnership. And then inside the legislature, House members work with House members, Senate members work with Senate members, and then House and Senate members in the district should team up, you know, because there's strength in numbers.
Absolutely.
Actually, we have a real-time example of that. Natalie and I filed a bill during the shutdown. So Rep. Blay, we filed the bill that said, that basically called out the governor for what was inexcusable lack of attention to the workers, the federal workers, and the economic impact. And so we said, no, the government has to start talking to people about what we can and should do. And we filed that bill on January 18th, and we worked in separate chambers to move it. It was the first bill that passed in the House.
Wow.
It was.
I didn't know that.
And in the Senate president created a working group, which she appointed me to. It was a great honor. And we moved together, and then we eventually won a hearing with the governor, where the governor's folks had to tell us, and we had to tell them about the kind of programs that should be put in place. Now, in fact, thank God, the shutdown ended. But what we have now, because of that partnership, a House and Senate partnership, we have a much greater awareness about the impact of federal shutdowns on our constituents, and we have a whole long list of things that our government should be doing immediately that we didn't do immediately. And we have two chambers tuned in. And that was two freshmen, first year, I don't like to say freshmen, you know, two first-year representatives, a senator and a representative going in, but we said, let's join forces and do this together. And we ultimately prevailed.
Fantastic.
It was great.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly punitive against workers during the shutdown. And I did listen to you when you talked about folks that had SNAP benefits, how it was all front-loaded. I think you used that front-loaded, leaving good portions of the month, the end of the month, and the beginning of the following month with no money.
February. The last couple of weeks of February were super tough. The food banks, like the Food Bank of Western Massachusetts, totally came up and helped close the gap. But it was a pretty scary time.
Very scary, yeah. So, cherish.
Sorry, we got a little.
No, it's all important.
Yeah.
All of this is important to me and to all of us here. So,
you're good. Cherish Act. So, you know, really, this is a partnership between the MTA and me, right? The MTA, this is, it was the first bill I filed, you know, because I wanted to just send a signal that it was such an honor to be in partnership. So it is a smart bill. It's a sister to the Promise Act, as you said. So it's public higher ed. So that's our community colleges like Greenfield Community College, like the University of Massachusetts, Westfield State. You know, we are rich in public colleges and universities here in the region. And so it says a couple things. One is it says, okay, there was a commission that found, not unlike K through 12, we've been underfunding our public colleges and universities to the tune of about $500 million annually. So it says we are going to catch up. We're going to go back to a base of 2001, where we've been sliding back since then. And that's by both cuts and also at level, because of level funding. And level, when we level fund, it's tantamount to a cut. Because if we level fund, but the cost of living keeps going up, you know, where there's a gap. It becomes a greater and greater gap in funding. Even though we're saying, oh, it's the same money as last year. Well, things are that much more expensive this year. So it's really a cut if things aren't, just if they don't rise with inflation. So it says, let's go back to 2001, to a time where we were investing $500 million more annually than we are now, 18 years ago. Let's reset. And that's a very good idea. And it's a good idea because of these schools need a greater infusion of funds. But it's also a really good idea because, as you know, as being a mom, student debt is a terribly scary...
Also a former student.
And a former student, right. Student debt is a terribly scary reality for our students, right? And it just begins to determine the fate of someone after they leave college, what job they're going to be able to take, whether or not they can actually even stay in school, let alone graduate. So it holds tuition static for a period of time as everything recalibrates. So this bill could be part of an arresting of a continued climb for public education. And it could give the universities and colleges the resources they need to keep the excellence up in these public institutions.
Right. But there's another bill out there.
Oh, the Promise Act.
There's another bill out there, your Promise Act, yes, but, and let's talk about that, but also let's talk about how these two bills stand apart from Baker,
So Baker doesn't have a higher ed bill.
He does not have a higher ed bill, but his vision of increasing funding for public schools. So he doesn't have a higher ed bill, but in terms of Promise. And Baker, yes. So
the governor has a lot of departures from Promise. So let's just talk about Promise really quickly.
Absolutely.
Promise K through 12. It's an empty. It's in the Senate. Sonia Chang Diaz has it. In the House, Aaron Vega, who's just a rock star, has it. And I should have said Rep. Paul Mark and I have cherished together, along with Rep. Sean Garbely, who's a great higher ed advocate. So we have nice representation here in the Western Mass region for these bills. So Promise says, actually, look, there was a Foundation Budget Review Commission in 1993. And in 1993, this is a long time ago. In 1993, we said, okay, our schools are unequal because rich communities have better schools, poor communities have poorer schools. This is ridiculous. This is a civil rights violation, right? And again, this is an indication of when people power really changed the calculus, because it was people who won this.
Right.
And there was a Foundation Budget Review Commission, and we said, okay, there's a foundation formula that's going to set a floor for public education, and then we're going to determine how much the state pays in. Okay, that's a good in concept. What hasn't happened, though, is we haven't adjusted that floor or the formula for what the state pays in all these years, since 1993.
Right.
And the world is different. I think we can all agree, probably everybody listening can agree, or watching can agree, that the world is different than it was in 1993. So it's different by a number of measures, not things like special ed, ELL, English language learners, healthcare costs, capital needs for buildings. All of these things are different. We're in a different world. It also, the foundation budget didn't look at the kind of complexity, the race-class complexity of needing to really understand what's needed in a poorer school district to be able to level the playing field. And, you know, for us here in the rural area, it didn't look at what's called a rurality factor, or what we're calling a rurality factor or sparsity factor, like they did in Wisconsin, where it didn't say, hey, look, you know, places with lower declining population, places with smaller population, we don't have the economies of scale in those places. We have enormous transportation costs, where it's more complicated there for education. So it didn't bake in all of these other things, right? The race and class parity, the rurality factor,
special education.
SPED, right? So it didn't bake that in. So the Promise Act not only says, okay, you know, we are underfunding K through 12 at $1 billion. We're $1 billion short. So that's the amount. It says, actually, it's also the how we're funding it that's broken. We need to change the formula. You know, that's where I come in as your senator. I'm at the table. We had a Rural Schools Day, thanks to Senator Hines, who really has been anchoring this. Natalie helped welcome and lead. And so superintendents from rural districts out here came in, and we said, look, we have things that you have to consider in baking into the formula, which is tremendously exciting. And, you know, of course, other advocates, you know, have been at the table last session for other, you know, other issues like ELL and SPED that we want to bake in differently. And then there's the amount, the $1 billion. So it's the amount and the how that we're really starting to talk about. And March 22nd is the first hearing where we are determined to both front burner this conversation and really make sure, as the MTA has demanded, that we get this done by the time the kids get back to school in the fall. That the world is different for our schools, that school districts, you know, don't have to look at these groaning budgets with not enough state aid.
And the hearing starts at 10 o'clock in the morning.
10 o'clock at Gardner Auditorium. So it's very exciting. And, you know, and I know the MTA is doing this. Our team is going to do this. My district director, Elena, sent a letter out to all school and town officials saying, hey, this is it. This is the generational chance we have. It starts on March 22nd to just change it. Change this whole paradigm.
And even though Baker doesn't have a bill for public colleges and universities, there is a connection between his perspective on funding schools, his bill that counters the Promise Act, and how that floats up to higher education. Can't really separate the two, funding pre-K through 12 and then inviting students to come to public colleges and universities with having an underfunded school system, increase, you know, student debt, et cetera. It's all connected.
Absolutely. And, you know, so to talk to your question about the difference in the governor's budget, there are a lot. Let me just talk about a couple of them. One of them is actually in how we're going to, I'm trying to think of how I can do this, it's not super weedy, but in how we're going to raise the amount of money. Because he's also, at least on the surface, talking about raising the amount of money that schools get. What he's not saying is that that money won't only be from the state. We say, the Promise Act says, no, the state has to pony up
Right.
$1 billion extra. So over 5 years, we jump up $200 million more every year. That's important to know too. People are like, oh,
Right.
how are you going to get $1 billion immediately? Well, we're not. But we can get $200 million
Right.
immediately, and we can make a plan for next year for that next $200 million. So it's, you know, so it's a very pragmatic bill, the Promise Act, and I know the MTA has been really at the table, really looking at the way in which we'll get this done. The governor's bill also makes noise about adding more money, but when you look at his numbers, you recognize, one, it's not the same threshold as the Promise Act, but two, local cities and towns will actually have to pay greater and greater amounts, which is exactly what can't happen in Western Massachusetts, or I would imagine in many places in the Commonwealth, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a little bit funny money, smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
And we're saying no to that. Another thing that's true is that he looks at charter schools and he shortens the amount of time that a district would get reimbursed for charter schools.
For the loss, right.
And again, when you look at that number, those numbers, it actually means a real decline in charter school reimbursement.
Exactly.
Which is, of course, another kind of deal breaker for us.
Right.
You know, so because you know that funding for our schools is just the raw dollars, and then it's charter reimbursement, it's transportation reimbursement. You know, those are the big ticket items that are in that school districts struggle with and that are in the mix.
And how we function in public schools.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, we need the transportation money, we need the special education money, and the needs of families are increasing, they're changing. More families are struggling. The family dynamics are different. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that we talked to the chair of education on Rural School Day about, Jason Lewis, who's, you know, a nice guy. You know, I know Sonia Chang Diaz has led that committee with grace and distinction. And, you know, I know Jason is going to lean heavily on Sonia.
Right. Great.
And, but, you know, what we made a point of saying to Jason when the rural school superintendents were out in the meeting was, you know, out where we are, a school is a community center. So to your point that our families are changing, our communities are changing, often the school is the place where families can get connected to food
That's right.
security, they can get connected
Absolutely.
to dentistry and counseling,
Absolutely.
clothing. Like
Absolutely.
they are community centers that are making up for some of the fraying social safety net. It's where we can get them connected to a community action, for example.
So that's why we talk about, you know, we only have a couple more minutes, but
Okay, yeah.
a couple of seconds maybe. But that's why we talk about teachers teach the whole child.
Yeah.
Their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, et cetera. So again, the two bills are separate, but together, tied together. So I so much appreciate all the work that you're doing on behalf of public school students and educators and advocates for public education and all the other bills, because all of this affects all of us as we live our daily lives. And we're going to continue to talk about public education, women's rights. And so I appreciate you being here.
Well, Maryelen, I appreciate you and everything you do in the community.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. This has been Democracy Here, and my guest, Senator Jo Comerford.
Come on,
Thank
you good workers, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? My mother is a feminist and she taught me to see until we all have justice, not one of us is free. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Title VII don't protect me from the pay inequality. I work for the man each day, but the man don't work for me. Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my sisters? Which side are you on? I don't need those corporations sucking on my tit. A little socialism don't scare